2 is not that hard. In fact, this is all about the matter in chapter 2, which raises this question: why does matter matter? Well, matter is anything that has weight or mass and then takes up space. And everything is made of matter. And since we're focusing on the human body in this class, the human body, like all living things, is made up of matter. So what does matter consist of, and how exactly does it work? Well, matter is made up of elements. So you might remember the periodic table, the elements and all those parts to it, all those different elements. But let's just take, for example, the lead in a pencil, which is made mostly of the element carbon. So that graphite in the pencil is made by this element carbon. Carbon, the element, if we looked at it really, really close, we would notice that that element is made up of a whole bunch of smaller things. Those are called atoms. So if I look at just one carbon atom, join those carbon atoms together in this configuration, I can get the graphite of this pencil from that element carbon. Well, the human body is made up of a significant amount of elements, some of which are more prominent than others. So I've got those listed here. So carbon is definitely one of the more common elements in the human body. Carbon is essential for all organic molecules. We call it organic molecules because they make and use carbon as an element. But carbon is important because of the way it can bend into rings and chains and make these macromolecules that are essential to your body, like proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, things like that are carbon-based compounds. So carbon is important because that's the basis for organic molecules, which is what living things are, organic. Hydrogen is important because hydrogen can bond easily to all kinds of other atoms. Now, that might not make a whole lot of sense yet, but when we look at bonding a little later, we'll see why hydrogen can be so important for chemical bonding. Oxygen is important, and it's important for cellular respiration. So when your cells need energy, if oxygen is present, then those cells can make a lot of energy. We call that whole chemical process, cellular respiration. Oxygen is essential for that. You might remember what N stands for. Nitrogen. And nitrogen is important for building proteins as well as nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. Those are nitrogen-based compounds. P stands for phosphorus, which is also important for DNA, as well as ATP, this energy molecule in the cell. So cells need lots of energy, and ATP, the chemical bonds in that molecule, are important for cells. K stands for potassium, so don't get confused with that. Potassium. And you need that for good muscle nerve function. So for your muscles and your nerves to be functioning correctly, we need lots of potassium. S stands for sulfur. Sulfur is important for building some proteins. So some proteins require sulfur for them to be functional. So sulfur is important for proteins, and a lot of your body is made up of proteins. Na stands for sodium. Sodium has a lot to do with fluid balance. So if you have a lot of sodium, let's say, in your bloodstream, the fluid moves into your bloodstream, raises your blood pressure, and we say, oh, be careful, you need to eat less sodium. So get that sodium out of your diet. But sodium is important for that movement of fluid between the cells and the area around the cells. Calcium is important for strong bones. We think about drink a glass of milk, get some calcium, strong bones. But is it just about strong bones? No. Calcium is important for other things too, besides strong bones: blood clotting, muscle contraction, as well as some fluid balance. So calcium is a pretty important element in our human body. Magnesium is needed in the blood, and chlorine is also important for fluid balance. We'll see more later. So these are some of the important elements in the human body. So if I were to take that element and just look at one atom, like one small particle of it. So like here, the smallest particle of an element is an atom. If I were just to look at one of those atoms, what are some of the parts of that atom that I would see? Let's say we were looking at an element, and we just want the smallest particle of that element. Well, that smallest particle of an element is an atom. What are some of the main parts to an atom? Like, what's an atom consist of? What's it made up of? So let's take a look at some of these subatomic parts, and let's see if we can identify them. Like, here's a part that has no charge. That's called a neutron. Neutrons have no charge. Neutron, no charge. Here's a particle that does have a charge. We'll call that a proton. Proton, positively charged. Yeah. Here's a particle that has a negative charge. That's an electron. Electrons have a negative charge. This whole big mass of protons and neutrons in the middle of our atom is called the nucleus. All right, so this whole part right here is called the nucleus, where the protons and neutrons are. In this first energy level around our atom, it can hold up to 2 electrons. And in this outer, the second energy level, it can hold up to 8 electrons. For it to be stable, it can hold up to 8 electrons for stability. So let's kind of review some of these atomic parts. Here's a part, no charge, neutron. Here's a part, positive charge, proton. Here's a part, negative charge, electron. All these protons and neutrons together make up the nucleus of the atom. This first energy level can only hold 2 electrons before it's full. The second energy level can hold up to 8 electrons before it's full. So what makes it an ion? And why are most atoms neutral? Why is it that most atoms don't even have a charge? Well, notice closely the protons in the nucleus. 1, 2, 3 positive charges. Notice the negatively charged electrons surrounding the nucleus. 1, 2, 3 negative charges. So 3 positives, 3 negatives together make a neutral atom. So what's an ion then? An ion is just an atom that has a charge, either a positive charge or a negative one. So how could I get an ion? Well, one way I could get an ion is taking away an electron. If there's an electron taken away, I'll have 1, 2, 3 positives and 1, 2 negatives for a positively charged ion. What if I add an electron? So let's stick another electron up here, and I add an electron. Now I have 1, 2, 3, 4 electrons, and 1, 2, 3 protons. It's going to be a negatively charged atom. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, all you've done is either add an electron or taken one away. Why don't you add protons or take them away? It's a good question. That's because if I add a proton or take a proton away, I have a totally different atom. All right? The element will change. So let's take a closer look at those kind of things. So when we look at the periodic table and we see a symbol like this, C stands for carbon. Above it, we'll see this number 6. The 6 is the atomic number. In other words, that's the number of protons that that element has. All right, it's the number of protons. So if I have 7 protons, if I add 1, then it's nitrogen. Different atomic number, totally different element. Not the same. This number down here is the atomic mass, or how much does this atom weigh? So how do I figure out an atomic mass? Well, it's just this kind of simple math problem. Here's how it works. I take 6 protons plus the number of neutrons, and that equals the atomic mass. So 6 plus what equals 12? Well, you're like 6. 6 plus 6 equals 12. That means there's 6 neutrons in carbon. So carbon has 6 protons and 6 neutrons. And if it's a neutral atom, that means it has 6 electrons, because 6 positives, 6 negatives to be a neutral atom. But you might be thinking now, I have 6 protons plus this number n neutrons equals the atomic mass or the weight of the atom for 12. You might be thinking, what about the electrons? Don't they weigh anything? Aren't they in there? Don't they count? Seems like it's a little unfair to count protons and neutrons and then just ignore the electrons. Well, think of it kind of like this. The electrons are so small that they don't add any appreciable weight to the atom. So let's say I had a scale big enough to weigh the whole world. So I'm weighing the whole world. Just as I'm about to set the world on the scale, an airplane takes off. Now, when that airplane takes off, is it going to change the weight of the whole world? Yeah, it will. Will it change it enough to be measured by the scale? Probably not. And that's where we're at here. The protons and neutrons are heavy enough to actually add mass to the atom. The electrons aren't heavy enough to add mass to the atom. What about oxygen? Oxygen has 8 protons. So if it's a neutral atom, it means it's also going to have 8 electrons. So if I have 8 protons and the atomic weight is 16, 8 plus how many neutrons equals 16? Well, 8 plus 8 equals 16. So there's 8 neutrons there. 8 protons, 8 neutrons, and if it's a neutral atom, 8 electrons. Now that raises this question then, what's an isotope? You might have heard of like carbon-14 or carbon dating like that. Or radioisotopes that are used, like iodine, that are used for medical imaging, or maybe even the uranium isotopes that are used for nuclear bombs. So what makes an isotope an isotope? An isotope is simply the element with a different number of neutrons, right? A different number of neutrons. Same number of protons, different number of neutrons. The protons can't change. So I've got protons, neutrons, and electrons in my atom. If I change the number of electrons, then I've got an ion. It's either going to be positively charged or negatively charged. If I change the number of neutrons, then I have an isotope. Same number of protons, different number of neutrons. Now you might be thinking, okay, 8 protons, 8 neutrons, 6 protons, 6 neutrons, are all the elements the same? And the answer is no. Take a look here at hydrogen. Hydrogen has an atomic number of 1. That means it has 1 proton. 1 proton plus what gives us an atomic mass of 1? How many neutrons does hydrogen have? Well, 1 plus 0 is 1. So hydrogen does not have any neutrons whatsoever. But an isotope of hydrogen might have a neutron. So let's take a look at some of the main elements in the human body. Oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium. And I see here how much we have in the human body. But it raises this question. I know that water is H2O. And I know that the human body is made up of around 70% water. So the human body, 70% water. Water is H2O. That means I've got an H connected to an oxygen, connected to another hydrogen, like that. That seems strange to me because I have 2 H's, 1 O. So 2 hydrogens, one oxygen. If I have two hydrogens and one oxygen, how is it that oxygen is 65%, hydrogen is way down here at 9%? Because most of my body is made up of water, H2O, and I have two hydrogens for every one oxygen. How is it that oxygen is 65% of my body and hydrogen is down here at 9? So that might be kind of puzzling until I look a little closer at the chart. Approximate percentage of the human body by weight. So that's key. Why is that key? Well, because the atomic weight of oxygen is 16. The atomic weight of hydrogen is 1. So which one weighs more? Well, oxygen weighs 16 times as much. So if I were to count the individual atoms, my body would have way more atoms of hydrogen. But when I'm looking at it by weight, each molecule or each atom of oxygen weighs 16 times as much as the hydrogen. So when looking at it by weight, oxygen way up there, whereas hydrogen, I have a lot of it, but just doesn't weigh nearly as much. I mentioned earlier hydrogen is important to the human body because of the way it bonds. Atoms will bond together for stability. Those outer energy levels need to be full for the atom to be stable. 2 in the first energy level, 8 in the second energy level. They need that stability. So what will happen is those atoms, whenever they're unstable, whenever there's open spaces in those energy levels, they will try to fill it with an electron from somewhere. Usually it's from another similar atom. They'll just share it. And those are called covalent bonds. Sometimes, though, the atom will either gain an electron from another atom or give their electron to another atom. And when they do, that's called an ionic bond because they're making an ion. They're either gaining or losing an electron to get either a positive or negative charge. And that creates what's called an ionic bond. Covalent means they're sharing the valence electrons. The outer electrons are being shared so that they can be stable. So let's look at an example of some chemical bonding. So here I have an atom of sodium. 11 protons to be neutral, 11 electrons. 1, 2 in the first energy level is full. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's 8 in the second energy level. It's full. Now I've got this 11th electron in the third energy level. So sodium has 1 electron. It needs 8 to have that energy level full and stable. It has 1, it needs 8. That's a pretty unstable element. Chlorine has 17 protons, which means it also has 17 electrons. 2 in the first energy level, 8 in the second energy level, that makes 10. 7 in the third energy level. So chlorine is thinking, I just need 1 electron to be stable. Sodium is thinking, I just need to get rid of 1 to be stable. If I could just get 1 electron, I'd be stable. If I could just get rid of this electron, I'd be stable. Where can I find an electron to be stable? How can I get rid of an electron to be stable? You want to get rid of an electron? I want to get rid of an electron. I would love to have an electron. Great, take it. So sodium gives up its electron so that chlorine will have 8 in its outer energy level and sodium will have 8 in its outer energy level. That creates a sodium ion, a positive charge, because it's given away a negative electron. Chlorine is negative now because it's taken on an extra negative electron. That electron's attracted to this large nucleus with all its positive charges. And it creates something new. Sodium is a very reactive metal. chlorine is a poisonous gas. But together, they make something we all love, table salt. Oxygen needs 8 electrons in the outer energy level. So here, the oxygen atoms are just going to share their electrons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You're like, well, wait, Professor. You just counted those electrons twice. That's true because they're sharing it. This oxygen is sharing those electrons. This oxygen is sharing those electrons. So it counts for both. Both are stable. This is a much stronger bond than the ionic bonds. It's a covalent bond where they're just sharing the electrons in the outer energy level. A compound then is when we have two different atoms joined together and the characteristics are completely different. When the two atoms are separate, they're one thing. When they're joined together, they're something completely different. That makes a compound. Molecules are just atoms joined together. All right, so a definition for a molecule is just atoms joined together. A definition for a compound are different atoms joined together, and the traits are different once they're joined. So carbon is one thing, hydrogen is another, but together to make methane, it's completely different. Here we just have two hydrogens sharing their electrons in a covalent bond. That's a hydrogen molecule. So it's just atoms sharing electrons makes a molecule. So let's build some molecules. All right, so let's build some. So for example, if I take hydrogen and oxygen, I can get water. I can take some hydrogen and carbon, I can get methane gas. I can take oxygen and carbon and get carbon dioxide. I can take chlorine and hydrogen and get some hydrogen chloride. I can take nitrogen and chlorine and they don't bond together at all. So let's ask, is water a molecule, compound, both, or neither? In this case, water is both. Different elements together make something completely different. Oxygen here, hydrogen here, but together they make something totally different, water. And they're different elements, hydrogen and oxygen. Nitrogen has an atomic number of 7. How many protons and electrons? So if the atomic number is 7, that is the number of protons. If it has 7 positives, that means it must have 7 negatives to be neutral. We also know that the atomic weight is 14, so 7 protons plus 7 neutrons is 14. Which two atoms are useful for fluid balance? Mostly sodium and chlorine, the table salt that we typically eat. Very useful for fluid balance. How much of the body is made up of water? Between 67 and 70%. So let's look at the role of water in the body. If most of the body is made up of water, 67 to 70%, then our bodies are going to have a lot of traits that water has, a lot of the characteristics of water. For example, water has a very high heat capacity. That means that it takes a long time to heat up and a long time to cool down. It can absorb a lot of heat before the temperature starts to change. Our body is the same way. We can be outside in the hot weather and it doesn't change our body temperature very easily. We can be outside in the cold weather and our body temperature stays pretty much the same, 98.6, because water has a high heat capacity. So how does that water work to maintain our body temperature? One way is because water has a high vaporization temperature. That means when water, the liquid, turns into a vapor, it takes a lot of heat energy with it. So when we sweat and our bodies are covered with sweat, we've been working out and running and exercising, our bodies are all sweaty. When that sweat evaporates, it takes a lot of that heat with it, which helps keep our body nice and cool. So water works hard to maintain our body temperature. In the wintertime, it takes a long time for a pond to freeze. You might be waiting to go ice skating because the pond water hasn't frozen yet. Our body, since it's made of water, again, takes a long time to cool down. So our body doesn't get cold super quick. And water is the body's chief solvent. That means that it dissolves things. So we eat certain things, water helps to break it down. Water helps breaking down those chemical bonds, a solvent. So we put things into our body, the water in our body helps to break those things down into chemicals that we can use. All right, so life depends on water. How does water help the body maintain homeostasis or stay the same? Homeostasis just means like keeping the body the same. Well, by taking on some of the characteristics of water, namely high heat capacity, high vaporization temperature, maintaining the body temperature, a solvent, dissolving things. So we might ask, what's so important about matter? Well, I think I've told you all that matters about the matter in chapter 2, part 1.